It was supposed to be just another quiet night in the neighborhood, until a pounding at the door shattered the silence. At first, I thought it was some late-night mistake, maybe a delivery gone wrong. But then the noise grew louder, more violent, like someone was determined to break in. And when I looked through the peephole, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a stranger. It was a member of the HOA, someone who believed they had more control over my home than I did. They weren't just knocking, they were furious. And when their so-called master key failed to work, they resorted to pure aggression. In that moment, I realized this wasn't about rules or regulations. It was about power. What happens when the people meant to protect your neighborhood turn it into a battlefield? Keep watching, because this night turned into a standoff no homeowner should ever face. For years, I thought I had found the perfect neighborhood. It was the kind of community people dreamed about, lined with tidy sidewalks, perfectly manicured, lawns and rows of houses that all seemed to match in some subtle, unspoken way. Families waved politely as they passed each other on evening walks, kids rode their bikes in lazy circles on cul-de-sacs, and holiday decorations appeared on cue, as if choreographed by some unseen hand. On the surface, it looked peaceful, predictable, and safe. That's exactly what I wanted: stability. I had worked hard to get here. The house wasn't extravagant, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. A modest two-story with a small yard, a porch swing I'd always wanted, and enough space inside to finally feel like I wasn't living on top of someone else. Moving in felt like a fresh start, a chance to put down roots. But if there's one thing I learned quickly, it's that appearances can be deceiving. The neighborhood wasn't just a neighborhood. It was governed. Every flower bed, every mailbox, and every shade of exterior paint had rules attached to it. The HOA didn't just manage the community pool or mow the common areas. They dictated, they inspected, they watched. At first, I didn't think much of it. Rules were rules, right? Keep things clean, make it fair for everyone. That's what I told myself. Still, there were signs early on that something was off. At the very first HOA meeting I attended, I noticed how certain board members carried themselves, not like volunteers helping a neighborhood, but like rulers presiding over their territory. One woman in particular stood out. She was sharp and commanding and always seemed to know everything happening on every street. When she spoke, others stayed quiet, as if they were afraid to disagree. It was subtle, but the message was clear. This wasn't just a role for her. This was power. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was overanalyzing. But soon after, I started receiving little reminders that someone was paying close attention to my home. A note about my trash bins being visible for too long. A warning that my lawn was slightly overgrown. Even a comment about the color of my porch light, which apparently wasn't community approved. None of these things were serious, but they built an unsettling feeling that no matter what I did, I was being watched, judged, and documented. Most neighbors didn't talk about it openly. They smiled in passing and waved at block parties, but when the subject of the HOA came up, there was a tension in the air. Everyone seemed to know that pushing back wasn't worth it. The board had authority, and authority here meant control over fines, violations, and even legal action if they wanted to press hard enough. For many, silence was the easiest option. At home, I tried to focus on the good. My dogs loved the yard, running back and forth until they were out of breath. On weekends, I'd grill on the patio, the smell of barbecue drifting into the evening. For a while, life was good, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking on eggshells. Every improvement I made, every small change, I wondered if someone was watching. Then came the first real confrontation. It started with something small, a letter slipped under my door. No envelope, no signature, just a note typed in block letters. It wasn't a friendly reminder. It was a demand. Remove the unauthorized fixture immediately. The so-called fixture was nothing more than a decorative hanging planter I'd placed on the porch. I remember staring at that paper, stunned at how petty it felt. A planter? That was the problem? But when I asked around, I realized this was how it began for many others. Small warnings, then bigger ones. A pattern designed to show you who was really in charge. And the person most often behind it? The same woman I had noticed at that first meeting. Neighbors called her strict. Some whispered other words: controlling, obsessive, power-hungry. To me, she seemed like someone who had confused community service with personal authority. I started noticing her car driving slowly through the streets at odd hours, headlights cutting across lawns. She always seemed to know too much about what was happening at everyone's homes. That's when I began to realize this wasn't just an HOA board. It was her board, and as much as I wanted to believe that following the rules would keep me safe, I couldn't ignore the gnawing truth. Sooner or later, she would set her sights on me. The question was never if, it was when. It didn't take long before the warnings turned into something heavier. At first, they were just notes about small things. A planter here, a trash bin there. But soon, the HOA's demands began to sharpen into fines, threats, and constant pressure. It was like being under a magnifying glass, with every detail of my home and life under inspection. The first official fine came in the mail. An envelope, stamped with the HOA's seal, with bold red letters on the inside. Violation notice, failure to comply. According to them, the grass in my yard had exceeded the maximum height allowance. I remember walking outside, tape measure in hand, checking the blades of grass in disbelief. Was this really happening? The lawn looked fine, better than fine. But reason didn't matter. The letter was final. Pay the fine or face further consequences. I paid it. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want trouble. But trouble was coming anyway. 2 weeks later, another notice arrived. This time, it was the color of my blinds. Non-conforming with community standards. The blinds were a neutral beige, hardly shocking, hardly rebellious, yet somehow they weren't approved. If I didn't replace them, another fine would follow. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control. Each new letter carried the same tone: stern, demanding, cold. But what made it worse was the timing. They always seemed to arrive after she had driven past my house, the board president. The same woman I'd seen prowling through the neighborhood at night, headlights lingering, clipboard in hand. She had taken an interest in me, and it wasn't casual. It was targeted. The neighbors whispered about it. Some told me to just give in, change the blinds, repaint, and comply with whatever she wanted. Others said they'd been through the same nightmare. Fined for holiday decorations, punished for leaving a bicycle in the driveway, even cited for planting the wrong kind of flowers. But no one wanted to fight back. They'd seen what happened when someone did. One man down the street had refused to remove a small shed he had built in his backyard. Within weeks, he was buried in legal notices. They dragged him into court, drained him with fees, and made an example out of him. The shed came down, and so did his peace of mind. People called it a warning. Cross the board, and you lose. So I tried to keep my head down. I tried to ignore the car parked across the street, late at night, and the way she seemed to write notes as she sat there in silence. But it was impossible to ignore the feeling that I wasn't just being observed. I was being stalked. Then came the late-night knocks. It started subtly, a soft rapping at the door, always around midnight or later. The first time, I thought maybe it was a mistake, some neighbor in need of help. But when I opened the door, no one was there. The second time, the same thing. The third time, I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving away down the sidewalk quickly, like they didn't want to be seen. I tried to convince myself it wasn't what I thought it was, that I wasn't being singled out, but deep down I knew better. This was her way of letting me know she was always there. And then, the harassment escalated. Another letter came, this one accusing me of running a business out of my home because of the extra deliveries I received. In reality, the packages were nothing more than pet supplies for my dogs, ordered in bulk to save money. But the HOA framed it as a violation, claiming it disrupted the residential nature of the community. Another fine, another threat of legal action. At this point, frustration turned into anger. I wasn't breaking rules. I wasn't disturbing anyone. My only crime was living in a way that didn't match her vision of control, and I started to realize that if I didn't push back, this would never stop. But pushing back wasn't easy. When I showed up at the next HOA meeting to voice my concerns, the room fell silent. She was there, of course, sitting at the head of the table like a judge presiding over a courtroom. The moment I began to speak, she cut me off, saying my time was limited and that complaints about enforcement weren't appropriate for discussion. I could feel the eyes of the other board members on me, nervous, cautious, unwilling to back me up. It wasn't a meeting. It was a performance, and the message was clear. Her authority wasn't to be questioned. Leaving that room, I felt defeated, but I also felt something else: determination. If she thought she could bully me into silence, she was wrong. That night, I started documenting everything. Every letter, every fine, every strange incident outside my house. I took photos, saved emails, and kept a log of times and dates. I didn't know exactly what I'd do with it yet, but I knew one thing. If this battle were coming, I'd be ready. But she wasn't finished. A few nights later, I heard it, the sound of metal scraping against my front door. My heart raced as I crept closer, listening. It wasn't knocking, it wasn't tapping, and it was the sound of a key twisting, failing to turn. Someone was trying to get in. For a moment, I froze. Then anger surged through me. I yanked open the door, but by the time I did, the porch was empty. Only the faint glow of taillights disappearing. Down the street gave me a clue. That's when I understood the full extent of her obsession. She wasn't satisfied with notes, with fines, or with late-night intimidation. She wanted control of my house. And when her so-called master key didn't work, she resorted to brute force. That night, I didn't sleep. Neither did my dogs. They paced near the door, growling at every sound. And I kept replaying the question in my head. How far would she go to prove she was untouchable? The next day, another violation notice arrived. This one claimed my dogs were a nuisance, even though they barked only when strangers approached. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was personal. She was trying to take away the one thing that made me feel safe. At that point, I knew the fight had reached a breaking point. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was crossing boundaries. No neighbor, no HOA president should ever cross, and I was done being afraid. The question was no longer whether I would fight back. The question was, how? The breaking point didn't come quietly. It came with a bang, quite literally, in the dead of night. It was just past 3 a.m. when the sound jolted me awake, a furious pounding at the front door. My dogs erupted, snarling and barking, claws scraping the hardwood as they lunged toward the noise. For a split second, I thought maybe it was an emergency, some neighbor in trouble or worse. But when I crept toward the peephole and looked out, my blood ran cold. It was her, the HOA president. Standing on my porch at 3 in the morning, fists clenched, eyes wild. She was muttering something I couldn't quite hear, fumbling with a key in her hand. The so-called master key, she believed, gave her power over every home in the neighborhood. She jammed it into the lock again and again, twisting violently, as if furious that it wouldn't give way. That was the moment my fear evaporated. For weeks, I had tried to play by the rules. For months, I had tolerated her notes, her fines, and her harassment. But this was different. This wasn't just intimidation. This was trespass. This was obsession. This was madness spilling out into the open. And my dogs knew it. They pressed against the door, growling so fiercely that their bodies trembled. Every second she rattled that lock, they grew louder, a warning that if the barrier broke, she would be met with more than she bargained for. I flipped on the porch light. The sudden glow froze her in place. She looked up, caught in the act, her face twisted in equal parts rage and panic. For a heartbeat, we just stared at each other through the glass, me on the inside, her on the outside, and a lifetime of neighborhood politics hanging in the silence between us. Then she kicked the door. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the still night. My dogs exploded, lunging so hard I thought the doorframe would splinter. And yet she didn't back down. She kicked again, harder, screaming. Something incoherent about authority and compliance. In that instant, it was clear. She wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. She was unraveling. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my voice shaking but firm as I explained that someone was trying to break into my home. The operator told me to stay inside, keep the door locked, and wait for officers to arrive. But every second felt like an eternity. My dogs barked themselves hoarse, the pounding continued, and my mind raced with questions. Would she actually get inside? What was she planning if she did? Finally, headlights cut across the street. Police cruisers rolled up, their lights painting the night in red and blue. She froze, mid-kick, her face illuminated in the flashing glow. For the first time, I saw something crack through her anger, fear. The officers stepped out, commanding her to back away. She tried to argue, waving her clipboard like a badge of power, insisting she had the right to be there, that she was performing her duties. But the officers weren't buying it. They pulled her aside, questioned her, and took my statement through the crack of the door while my dogs still rumbled with adrenaline at my side. It should have ended there, but it didn't. The next morning, she was back. Not at my door this time, but at the HOA office. She filed a complaint against me. She claimed my dogs were a threat, that I had provoked her, and that I was hostile and uncooperative. She wanted me fined, censured, and even removed from the neighborhood. That was when I made my move. Remember all those months of documentation? The letters, the notes, the photos, the log of late-night harassment? I had kept it all. And when I marched into the emergency HOA meeting she had called to discipline me, I carried a folder so thick it could barely close. The room was packed, neighbors curious, others nervous, some clearly tired of the endless drama. She sat at the front, chin lifted high, clearly expecting another performance where her word was law. But this time, I wasn't playing defense. I stood up and laid out every piece of evidence one by one: the bogus fines, the harassing letters, the surveillance of my home. At 3 a.m., I didn't raise my voice when I attempted entry. I didn't need to. The truth was louder than anything she had to say. Gasps rippled through the room as I described the night she kicked my door. People shifted uncomfortably as I played the audio from my 911 call, the barking dogs and the pounding echoes caught in the background. By the time I was done, the weight of her actions hung heavy in the air. She tried to fight back. She called me a liar, accused me of exaggerating, and even tried to spin it as routine compliance. But her voice cracked, her hands shook. And for the first time, the board didn't sit silently by. They asked questions, hard ones. Why was she at my home in the middle of the night? Why did she have an unauthorized master key? Why had she issued so many personal fines that never aligned with actual policy? Her answers stumbled, fell apart, and turned into contradictions. And then, the moment everything shifted, one of the quieter board members stood up. He revealed that others had complained too, that I wasn't the first and certainly not the only neighbor she had targeted. Slowly, others in the room began to nod, murmur, or even speak up. One woman recounted being fined for her holiday decorations. Another described late-night drive-bys. The illusion of her control cracked in real time, splintering under the weight of truth. It was no longer just my word against hers. It was the neighborhood against her. By the end of the meeting, the board had no choice. They voted to suspend her immediately, pending investigation. The woman who once strutted through the streets with a clipboard like a crown was left red-faced, sputtering, powerless. She stormed out of the room, but the echo of the gavel striking the table sealed her fate. For the first time since moving into that neighborhood, I felt the pressure lift. The fear, the surveillance, the constant tension, gone. But the story didn't end there. Because while the board had stripped her of authority, the damage she left behind lingered. The neighborhood was divided, some relieved, others shaken, all of us wondering how it had gone this far, how one person's hunger for control could twist a community into fear. And as I walked back to my home, dogs at my side, porch light glowing like a beacon, one thought burned in my mind. If this could happen here in a neighborhood that looked so perfect from the outside, how many other communities were hiding the same nightmare behind their picket fences? The meeting ended with a gavel strike, but in truth, it felt like the beginning of something much bigger. Walking out of that HOA chamber, I could still hear the buzz of voices, the uneasy laughter, and the whispers about what had just unfolded. For months, fear had kept the neighborhood quiet. But now, with everything dragged into the open, it was as if a weight had been lifted, not just from my shoulders, but from everyone's. Yet, even in that moment of relief, I knew the fight wasn't entirely over. People like her don't simply walk away quietly. They cling, they claw, they try to salvage control even when it's already slipping through their fingers, and that's exactly what she did. The very next day, emails began circulating, a desperate attempt to rewrite the story. She painted herself as the victim, claiming she had only been performing her duties and that I had orchestrated a smear campaign. But the more she talked, the worse it got. Neighbors weren't buying it anymore. They had seen the evidence, heard the recordings, and witnessed her unravel in front of everyone. For years, she had operated in the shadows, her power rooted in silence, in fear, in the idea that no one would ever stand up to her. But now, that silence was broken. And once it cracked, there was no putting it back together. Within weeks, the HOA board called for a special election. It was the first time in memory that such a vote had taken place, and the turnout was overwhelming. Ballots poured in, and when the results were announced, the verdict was decisive. She was removed from the board entirely. That was the public outcome. The humiliation, the loss of her title, her crown, her grip over the community. But privately, the fallout ran deeper. Neighbors who once kept their blinds shut and their heads down began to talk. Stories spilt out. Tales of fines that never made sense. Inspections that felt more like stalking, and the quiet dread that had hung over the neighborhood for years. It turned out I wasn't alone. I was simply the first to push back hard, enough to make the cracks visible. Strangely, the ordeal brought the community together. People who had barely spoken before now stopped to chat on sidewalks, sharing their own experiences, offering encouragement, and even apologizing for not stepping in sooner. The neighborhood that once felt cold, distant, and policed began to feel like an actual community again. And for me, the change was immediate. No more envelopes slipped under my door. No more phantom knocks at midnight. No more headlights lingering outside my house. My dogs went back to dozing peacefully at night instead of pacing and growling at shadows. I could finally sit on my porch swing without the creeping suspicion that someone was watching, measuring, or judging. It felt like peace. But peace came with lessons, too. Looking back, I realized how easy it had been to fall into the trap of silence. How many times I almost gave in, paid the fine, or convinced myself it wasn't worth the fight. That's how people like her thrive. Not because they're truly powerful, but because they rely on your fear. They count on your exhaustion. They want you to believe resistance is impossible. And the truth? Resistance isn't impossible. It's just hard. It means keeping records when you'd rather rip the paper up and throw it away. It means standing up in a room where every eye feels like it's against you. It means choosing confrontation when all you want is peace. But without that effort, without that pushback, the abuse of power only grows. The consequences of this showdown went beyond one woman. The HOA itself began to change. New board members were elected, people who actually wanted to serve, not control. Policies were rewritten, loopholes closed, and authority rebalanced. Transparency became the new standard, with open communication replacing backdoor decisions. For the first time, neighbors were encouraged to participate rather than being silenced. The scars were still there, of course. Some neighbors remained wary, still carrying the memory of how bad it had been. But those scars were also reminders. Reminders of what happens when one person's obsession goes unchecked, and how important it is to speak out before it's too late. As for her, after losing her position, she retreated. She kept to herself, rarely seen outside. Her car no longer crawled down the streets at night. The clipboard disappeared. Over time, she became a ghost in the very neighborhood she once ruled. People stopped fearing her. Eventually, they stopped talking about her altogether, and maybe that was the final justice. Not anger, not revenge, but irrelevance. Because power is only real when people recognize it. The moment they stop, it vanishes. Months later, I was sitting on that same porch swing, dogs sprawled at my feet, when a new neighbor walked by. They had just moved in and asked how I liked living here. For the first time since I moved in, I answered honestly, "It's a good place. It wasn't always, but it is now." That answer didn't come easily. It came from fire, from conflict, from sleepless nights and battles no homeowner should have to fight. But it also came from survival, from learning that peace doesn't come by avoiding conflict. Sometimes it only comes after you confront it head-on. And that's the takeaway I want you to hear. Behind the pretty fences and manicured lawns, not everything is as perfect as it seems. Sometimes the greatest threats to peace aren't strangers at all. They're the very people who claim to protect it. But you are never powerless. Not if you stand, not if you document, not if you refuse to be silenced. OAs, neighbors, communities. They can bring people together or they can tear them apart. The difference lies in who holds the power and whether anyone is brave enough to challenge it when it's abused. So the next time you hear a story like mine, or maybe even live one yourself, remember this: rules don't define a home, people do, and no board, no neighbor, No so-called authority has the right to take that away from you. Because at the end of the day, a house is just walls and wood. But a home? A home is built on dignity, safety, and the freedom to live without fear. And if someone tries to strip that away from you, well, you know now they can be stopped.